Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, laudetur Jesus Christus, in secula viva Christo Rey. Hope you're all having a wonderful Friday afternoon in the week of Christ the King. One of the greatest feasts, one of my favorites. Ever since I was growing up a Lutheran, we actually had that feast as well to some extent. But it is a feast against Reformation Sunday, which caused the origin of the breakdown of Christendom, which we've covered recently on this show. But today's topic is about conscience. We're going to be talking about some moral theology. We're going to be laying some groundwork, which is adding to the series on America and Americanism, which is part of the research I'm doing for my book, which will be released next year, about the role of America in the Catholic Church. It's, in my opinion, a very important topic to understand. But this show will actually we're not going to deal directly with America, but we're going to deal with conscience, which is a very important topic, and we'll lay the groundwork for that. So before we continue, please like and subscribe. Please share this video. I have to go against all the Marxist bots, so you sharing this video is helpful to us. Also, please consider becoming a patron. If you've been helped by this apostolate, please become a patron. That's patreon.com/meaningofcatholic. Helps us in our work, helps this apostolate to grow. Our mission is to unite Catholics against the enemies of Holy Church, preach the gospel, and save souls. So if you've been helped, please support us. You get free books. Also, for patrons, if you're already a patron, we are having a patron-only live broadcast tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. GMT. So shout out to my friend and brother Mark, one of our patrons. He's created a BitChute channel. So if and when the Marxists shut us down, we will be on BitChute. God willing, that doesn't happen, but BitChute is there, especially if you like BitChute. No commercials. The videos are on BitChute as well. So thank you, Mark, for your support. He's over in the Netherlands. Shout out to all our brethren who speak Dutch over there. Also, let me see what else before we get into that's it. Okay. So conscience. Why is this important? Well, there are many modern errors, which we're going to go through, I think 4 of them today. And especially when we talk about the election, which is going to happen in the United States and affect the whole world next Tuesday. And one of the most frequently seen recently is that the church does not teach you how to vote. It just leaves this to your conscience. The idea of conscience has been an excuse for heretics to avoid the church teaching and try to make their own way. It's been a very difficult thing to argue over the past 50, 60 years. The biggest one was the Humanae Vitae debate, which is where many prominent Catholics, even priests and bishops, university professors, were asserting that they had a conscience decision to go against Humanae Vitae and use the intrinsic evil of contraception, killing the life-giving act of conjugal love. So conscience is a very, very important topic. It's very, very important to understand. And so we're going to get into this. So most important thing here is Prumer. This is the source we use for basics. He was considered one of the best moralists before the council in the 1960s. So Prumer, this is his 1-volume work, Handbook of Moral Theology. So we're going to go through some of the definitions, then we'll talk about some of the errors. So first off, what is conscience? Well, Prumer says this, paragraph 135. Conscience is the judgment or dictate of the practical intellect deciding from general principles the goodness or evil of some act which is to be done here and now or has been done in the past. So conscience is an act. A lot of times you think of conscience as an organ in your brain or something, but conscience is forming a judgment. It's taking the general principles that we know, and then it's applying to a specific action that you are considering doing or that has already been done. So when we do an examination of conscience, at the end of the day, we are using our conscience, we're acting, using this act of our intellect. And Primer says it is the practical intellect. So that's a technical term for your intellect when it's working towards applying prudence to a given action, as opposed to the speculative intellect, which is where you're just kind of talking in theory. You're talking about things in theory. So the practical intellect is concerned with practical things. We're talking not in theory, but in practice. So the conscience is what connects the theory to the practice. The conscience act is taking the principles, applying it to an act. Now, here's where it gets really important. So, I'm going to skip down to 137. Here's Prumer. In regard to its conformity with eternal law, conscience is true or correct when it deduces correctly from true principles that some act is lawful. Okay, so the important thing here is that there is an eternal law. So the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. That's the eternal law. And the conscience is what takes the eternal law, which is the law in theory, and applies it to this particular act. So it's true if you are faced with a situation and you are taking the 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill. Am I killing if I do this act in this case, or is it self-defense, for example? This would be an act of conscience. Now, Prumer is saying that the conscience is true if you make a correct judgment. So you're making a correct judgment that's actually true. This would be an act of self-defense, and so this is not breaking the 5th commandment. And that's actually true objectively. So that God will not send you to hell because you're committing murder. You're not committing mortal sin by doing this act of self-defense. So that would be an act of your conscience, and if it's actually true in God's tribunal when you die, that means your conscience is true. So, however, there's also, your conscience can also be false. And what is that? It says, or erroneous, so Primer defines it, is when it decides from false principles consider as true that something is lawful when in fact it is not lawful. So you're thinking in your conscience that something, you have got false principles, and you think they're true, but they're actually not objectively. So subjectively they're true, according to your subjective opinion. They're true to you, but objectively they're not. So a true conscience is basically subjectively it's true and objectively it's true. A false conscience is subjectively it's true, objectively it's not true. So objective and subjective here. Now, here's where he continues to distinguish here. An erroneous conscience is further distinguished into a scrupulous conscience, which for useless or almost ridiculous reasons judges, or rather fears, that an act is evil when in fact it is not. So that's scruples. Or a perplexed conscience, which sees sin both in the performance and in the omission of acts. You don't know what to do. A lax conscience, which judges on insufficient grounds that there is no sin in the act, or that the sin is not so grave as it is in fact. And then the worst form of conscience, of a wrong conscience, is a hardened conscience, which, as the result of a long-established habit of sinning, regards all, or at least some, sins to be of little importance. And then he also adds another one, and he says the Pharisaic conscience minimizes grave sins, but magnifies matters of little importance in the same way that the Pharisees behaved. So if you're sinning all the time throughout your life, your intellect gets darkened, and you may have a hardened conscience because your intellect is so darkened that you're just rationalizing all of your sins, and your conscience is so darkened that now it's hardened. And that's a very bad state to be. That's damnation right there. So now here's another aspect that's very important in regards to the act of assent. So assent is an act of the will, not the intellect. Assent is an act of the will. So you can't actually do a sin or do a good deed unless you act on your will. So when we're talking about an intellect, we're just thinking about it. your conscience is not sinful. It can never be sinful because you're just thinking about it. We're not Lutherans. Lutherans believe that even an act of the intellect is sinful, basically. But the conscience is an act of the intellect, so you're just thinking about it. Now, when you're assenting to it, which is an act of the will, internal will, conscience is certain when, without any prudent fear of error, it firmly decides that some act is either lawful or unlawful. So you're certain. You got a certain conscience, you know if it's wrong or right. Probable, when it judges that some act is probably lawful or unlawful. Or doubting, when it hesitates to pass judgment on the moral act. So, and technically a doubting conscience is not a conscience at all, because the conscience needs to make a judgment. So it's not even act, it's not even completing the act of conscience. Now, this is very important because when we have a probable, when we talk about obedience to a lawful authority like your parents or a priest or the bishops of the Pope, if you have a certain conscience about what they're telling you to do, you obviously obey it. Now, if you have a probable conscience, you also obey because God has given us these lawful authorities to obey. So even if you're not entirely sure what they're saying is sinful or not, if you just have a probable conscience, you should still obey. This is according to St. Alphonsus in his sermon on obedience to your confessor. And he says that we need to obey in those cases. But then, if there is doubt, if you are in serious doubt whether or not this is sinful or not, that is when we cannot obey, because it is in a case which is manifestly, gravely sinful. We cannot obey such commands. So let's continue, because here's where we get into the important distinction between vincible and invincible. Okay, so how do you act on your conscience? Continuing. Here's Prumer. Everyone is obliged to use serious care to possess on all occasions a true conscience. So here's where we need to form our consciences. We must possess the truth. We must possess the true principles. We must possess how to understand the truth and get the true principles to act on that. Now, here's the key part right here. Prumer says this: everyone is obliged to follow his conscience, whether it commands or forbids some action, not only when it is true, but also when it is in invincible error. Okay? So we are bound to follow our conscience, even if it, objectively speaking, it's in invincible error. Because our conscience is the only act to discover what is the truth of a given situation and to do what is right. So if we subjectively believe something is wrong when in fact it's right, or when it's right or it's wrong, we have to follow that if it's in invincible error. Now, here's the distinction between invincible and invincible. This is very important. This is Prumer, paragraph 2. In relation to its subject, so subjectively speaking, ignorance is either vincible or invincible, depending on whether it can or cannot be removed by reasonable care, such as would be employed by prudent and upright men in similar circumstances. So we're talking about invincible. Invincible means you've done everything you possibly can to discover what is true. You have not been negligent in your studies. You've tried to study everything. You've talked to counsel. You've gotten counsel from wise men. You've asked God in prayer. You've done everything you possibly can. You've taken all reasonable care. And then you must act. So sometimes people get paralyzed by a scrupulous conscience. They won't act. Well, you need to take reasonable care to discover what is true, and then you must act. You can't stop from acting because you need to trust that God is guiding you as long as you take reasonable care. Now, if you're neglectful, if you get a lax conscience, you don't take any reasonable care. You don't try to form your conscience. You don't do anything there. Well, then you have a vincible erroneous conscience because you haven't done anything to actually form your conscience. Here's what Prumer says. It is not permissible to follow conscience when it is in vincible error, no matter whether it commands or forbids some action. On the other hand, one cannot act contrary to such a conscience. The error must be corrected before any action is taken. So, if you have not taken reasonable steps to form your conscience, to understand the general principles, to understand the situation, you have not done this, and you still don't know what to do, That is the point where you should not act. You need to remove the error. You need to know what to do, at least know some principles that apply. You need to take reasonable care. So that is why. So here, this is the key point, because this is where we get into the errors, okay? As will be proved, and we're not going to get into everything here, but a certain conscience alone is the lawful guide of morality. Okay, so key here. A certain conscience alone is the lawful guide of morality. You're certain. You've investigated it. You've tried to understand the truth, and then you can have a certain conscience. That is the only guide to morality. Listen to what he says next. A invincibly erroneous conscience is not a certain conscience. So if you have not taken reasonable steps, and you haven't gone through the steps, you've been lax. You haven't even tried to understand anything. You are vincibly ignorant. You're vincibly erroneous. So consequently, a man who acts while his conscience is in that state, vincibly ignorant, vincibly erroneous, exposes himself to the danger of sin. If a man's conscience is in error through his own fault, then he must correct that error by taking suitable means to discover the truth. If his efforts fail, he must refrain from action. But if even this is impossible, then he must choose what appears to be the safer course. So, we're in a situation where a lot of people talk about invincible ignorance, but I've never heard anyone ever say publicly, bishops, priests, about vincible ignorance. Now, we are in an age, one of the live chats, JJ's talking about, I have a hard time believing anyone is invincibly ignorant in the age of instant information. Right. Everyone in Euro-America, many of them, have heard of Jesus Christ. Well, then they have a duty to investigate it. The church, the gospel. They cannot assert that they are invincibly ignorant, unless they've done everything they possibly can in good conscience, in good faith, honestly, to investigate the truth. So, let's go through some of our modern errors and talk through these. So, error number 1, as long as you follow your conscience, you will do what is right about the election or you just follow your conscience. There's people who say, all you have to do is follow your conscience. You'll go to heaven. We'll get to that in a second. Here's the error. The church respects the conscience and will not interfere with conscience. Any interference with conscience is an attack on the dignity of man. False. This is an error. On the contrary, Veritatis Splendor 63. Here's John Paul II. It is always from the truth that the dignity of conscience derives. It is always from the truth that the dignity of conscience derives. In the case of the correct conscience, again, we're talking about these terms here, correct and erroneous. In the case of the correct conscience, it is a question of the objective truth received by man. In the case of the erroneous conscience, it is a question of what man mistakenly, subjectively considers to be true. It is never acceptable to confuse a subjective error about moral good with the objective truth rationally proposed to man in virtue of his end, or to make the moral value of an act performed with a true and correct conscience equivalent to the moral value of an act performed by following the judgment of an erroneous conscience. And he's referencing St. Thomas Aquinas De Veritate, question 17, article 4. This is exactly what people do. They equivocate people who have a true and correct conscience, and they make a total excuse to all the people who may indeed have an erroneous conscience, may have some ignorance, but they equivocate the two acts as they're just, in God's sight, they're just completely the same. Now he goes on, and this is great. It's very important. It is possible that the evil done as the result of invincible ignorance or non-culpable error of judgment may not be imputable to the agent. Right, we acknowledge that. But even in this case, it does not cease to be an evil. a disorder in relation to the truth about the good. Furthermore, a good act which is not recognized as such does not contribute to the moral growth of the person who performs it. It does not perfect him. It does not help to dispose him for the supreme good. Thus, before feeling easily justified in the name of our conscience, we should reflect on the words of the psalm, "Who can discern his errors? Clear me from my hidden faults." Psalm 18. There are faults which we fail to see, but which nevertheless remain false because we have refused to walk towards the light. Now, this is very important because people who are invincibly ignorant are still damaging their conscience, even if they're acting, even if they're not culpable technically. They're still damaging their soul. They're damaging their person. They're damaging themselves and society. Continuing on, conscience as the ultimate concrete judgment compromises its dignity when it is culpably erroneous. That is to say, when man shows little concern for seeking what is true and good, and conscience gradually becomes almost blind from being accustomed to sin. Gaudium et Spes 16. Jesus alludes to the danger of the conscience being deformed when he warns, the eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is sound, your whole body will be full of light, but if your eye is not sound, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Matthew 6. The words of Jesus just quoted represent a call to form our conscience, to make it the object of a continuous conversion to what is true and to what is good. In the same vein, St. Paul exhorts us not to be conformed to the mentality of the world, but to be transformed by the renewal of our mind. Romans 12. It is the heart converted to the Lord and to the love of what is good, which is really the source of true judgments of conscience. Indeed, in order to prove what the will of God, what is the good and acceptable and perfect, knowledge of God's law is certainly necessary, but it is not sufficient. What is essential is a sort of connaturality between man and the true good. St. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Secunda Secundae, question 45, article 2. So, the important thing is we need to form our conscience. Now, I want to recommend everyone, if you've never been over to the website, you can find resources. If you go up top here to resources, and there is prayer, spiritual classics. There's also a section on moral theology. So you can get Primer, everything I'm quoting here from Primer, you can get in an online version, digitized. You can also get the print version. And you also have St. Alphonsus, translated by Ryan Grant. Take a look at that. So these resources are here to break these things down. I mean, these are the sources that we use with Meaning of Catholic. So, let me see if I can get back on track here. Okay, so I got a question from JJ. Does invincible ignorance strictly mean it is impossible to know or just extremely difficult? No, it's not impossible to know, and we'll get into why it's not impossible to know. There is what you can know by natural reason, which the First Vatican Council says that you can know by natural reason that there is one God. Aristotle and Plato figured out that there was one God. That's just by your natural reason, just by God, what you have from God, what created you. But you cannot know that God is a Trinity without revelation. So that'll be clarified a little bit more too as we go along. Now, here is another important aspect. Error number 2. The freedom of conscience is the dignity of conscience. Error. Freedom means license. Freedom means power. So we have this idea about freedom in our modern world. But their definition of freedom actually means freedom from the church. That is what the modern world understands as freedom. When they say freedom, liberty, typically what they mean is freedom from the Catholic Church. That's not freedom. Their idea of freedom is being able to do whatever you want to. In other words, freedom is power. Freedom is the power to do whatever you want to. It's all about power. They understand human dignity as power. On the contrary, humility means conformity with the truth. True freedom is freedom from sin and error. Continuing with Veritatis Splendor, quote, Christians have a great help for the formation of conscience in the Church and her magisterium. as the council affirms, informing their consciences, the Christian faithful must give careful attention to the sacred and certain teachings of the Catholic Church. For the Catholic Church is by the will of Christ the teacher of truth. Her charge is to announce and teach authentically that truth which is Christ, and at the same time with her authority to declare and confirm the principles of the moral order which derive from human nature itself. Dignitas Humanae 14. It follows that the authority of the Church, when she pronounces on moral questions, in no way undermines the freedom of conscience of Christians. Okay, now check out this definition of freedom. This is what freedom really is. Quote again. This is so not only because freedom of conscience is never freedom from the truth, but always and only freedom in the truth. But also because the magisterium does not bring to the Christian conscience truths which are extraneous to it. Rather, it brings to light the truths which it ought already to possess, developing them from the starting point of the primordial act of faith. So, conscience is truly free when it is in conformity with the truth. Freedom, our Lord speaks of freedom. He says, all who commit sin are a slave to sin. If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. This is what true freedom is. Freedom is freedom from sin because we are in bondage to the devil. We are in bondage to the world, the flesh, and the devil in sin. That is what true freedom means. It does not mean freedom from the Catholic Church. Quite the contrary. And that's why when the heretics say to the Catholic Church, well, we need to have freedom of conscience, they simply mean freedom from the Catholic Church. But John Paul II says here, true freedom is not freedom from the truth, but freedom in the truth. That is, the truth will set you free. That's what actual freedom is. Error number 3. As long as anyone follows their conscience, they do not need to be baptized. This is the dare we hope thesis. Now, here is the New Catechism of John Paul II, paragraph 1778. There's a quote here from St. John Henry Newman, where he says, conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. What does he mean by that? Now, this is very important because the first pope, to my knowledge, the first pope ever to say that a non-Catholic can be saved, per se, in the sense in which he is speaking, is Pius IX. Blessed Pius IX, the hammer of liberalism. He said that, in theory, a man can follow his conscience by the natural law and can be saved outside the Catholic Church in the sense that he is not baptized. Now, what does he mean by this? This is what Newman is saying. There is an aboriginal vicar of Christ. That is the natural law, your practical reason. God gave you the practical reason. We have reason, we have intellect and will. This is what makes us different than the animals. You have natural reason. Now, what does this mean? If you ever hear a bishop or priest or anyone saying that everyone just needs to follow their conscience, well, take a look at what St. Paul says about this very thing. To the Romans, chapter 1, verse 16. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and to the Greek. For the justice of God is revealed therein from faith unto faith, as it is written, the just man liveth by faith. Now, why is there this gospel? St. Paul tells us, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and injustice of those men that detain the truth of God in injustice. Because that which is known of God is manifest to them, for God hath manifested it unto him. Now, later in chapter 2, he talks about the conscience of the pagan, the Greek, who has not the law of Moses. He has the law of natural law, his conscience. God has manifested it to him. There is the natural law, which is known by natural reason, which God has endowed in every human creature. What are the consequences of this? St. Paul says, verse 20, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, his eternal power also and divinity, so that they are inexcusable. Every human society, until 1776, has worshipped in a public cultus a divinity. Every single culture. There's never been an atheistic secular culture until 1776 in terms of the social makeup of the government. Because everyone has the natural reason to discern that there is a God. Some come to the conclusion that there are many gods, but even then, the pagan polytheists still have a high God. They have the highest God. Now, continuing on, what does this natural reason teach us? Because that when they knew God, they have not glorified him as God or given thanks, but became vain in their thoughts, and their foolish heart was darkened. Once again, when you don't follow a true conscience and your invincible error, you have vincible error, then you are going to darken your conscience. For professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into the likeness of the image of a corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed beasts, and of creeping things. Wherefore God gave them up to the desires of their heart, unto uncleanness, to dishonor their own bodies among themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God delivered them up to shameful affections, for their women have changed the natural use into that which is against nature. You can understand by basic reason that these acts are against nature. They do not act according to nature. And in like manner the men also, having the natural use of the women, having burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is filthy, and receiving in themselves the recompense which was due to their error. And as they liked not to have God in their knowledge, God delivered them up to a reprobate sense, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all iniquity, malice, fornication, avarice, wickedness, full of envy, murder, contention, deceit, malignity, whisperers, detractors, hateful to God, contumelious, proud, haughty, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, foolish, dissolute, without affection, without fidelity, without mercy. This is describing our modern world, who, having known the justice of God, did not understand that they who do such things are worthy of death. And not only that they who do them, but they also that consent to them to do them. Wherefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest. This is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. This is what this means. Leaders should not be excusing all of the filth and sin in this world. St. Paul says, thou art inexcusable. There are certain, when we talk about in theory, we talk about the noble savage in theory. There are certain pagans, in different historical records, who their society was built on a general theory of natural law. They were generally following the natural law, and these are the types of tribes that accepted the gospel when it was brought to them. But there are many other pagans, in many cases, the great majority of them, are being ruled by power and demons, because original sin darkens your intellect. Demons deceive you. This is why there is no sure hope to be saved outside the Catholic Church. Natural reason, natural law, conscience is not enough to have a sure hope to be saved. Now, I'm going to read from another document, Dominus Jesus in 2000. In my opinion, this is one of the best documents ever produced since Vatican II. Paragraph 5. The definitive and complete character of the revelation of Jesus Christ. It must be firmly believed that in the ministry of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God, who is the way, the truth, and the life, the full revelation of divine truth is given. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wishes to reveal him. Matthew 11. This is the Catholic Church. This is condemning the error that we can find the truth just anywhere. The fullness of the truth we must have the revelation. Our natural reason can only go so far, and it is often darkened. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Paragraph 20, it must be firmly believed that the church, a pilgrim now on earth, is necessary for salvation. The one Christ is the mediator and the way of salvation. He is present to us in his body, which is the church. He himself explicitly asserted the necessity of faith and baptism, and thereby affirmed at the same time the necessity of the church, which men enter through baptism as through a door. Lumen Gentium 14. It is clear that it would be contrary to the faith to consider the church as one way of salvation alongside those constituted by the other religions, seen as complementary to the church or substantially equivalent to her. As we said, there are some pagans which have a greater grasp of natural law in their society, and some are demonic. But none are sacramental and confer sanctifying grace. But the church. There is none that gives the sure hope of being saved, but the church. Here's the Dominus Jesus again. This is important. If it is true that the followers of other religions can receive divine grace, because God can give actual grace, which is actual graces of God, to all who are not Catholic. Because you can only become Catholic if God works on you with your grace. You cannot do anything for your salvation without grace. Quoting again, it is also certain that objectively speaking, they, the non-Catholics, are in a gravely deficient situation in comparison with those who, in the church, have the fullness of the means of salvation. However, all the children of the church should nevertheless remember that their exalted condition results not from their own merits, but from the grace of Christ. If they fail to respond in thought, word, and deed to that grace, not only shall they not be saved, but they shall be more severely judged. So Catholics, we must work out our salvation with fear and trembling. But in the same way as this, non-Catholics will also not be saved and are thus much less likely because they have no reasonable chance of receiving the necessary sacramental grace to be saved. So when we talk about dare we hope? Now, Pius IX, the same pope who said, sort of in theory, a non-Catholic can be saved. He also condemned in the Syllabus of Errors the proposition that we can have a sure hope that non-Catholics will be saved. Catholics cannot believe that we have a sure hope that non-Catholics will be saved. There is no certainty. There is no sureness. There is no reasonable hope that they will be saved. We can talk in theory. In theory, has the church ever confirmed that a single soul is in heaven who is not Catholic? Which saint was canonized for this? It is more rational to hope that heaven is empty of noble savages than hell is empty at all. A good hope is a reasonable hope based on reason, based on what we know. We cannot have a reasonable hope that non-Catholics will be saved. We can speak in theory. Okay, in theory, if we deduce these from reasonable conclusions, if someone conceivably is in invincible error, they follow the natural law by actual grace. God has given them the actual grace to follow the natural law. Perhaps, in theory, they could be saved. But the church has never canonized a saint who is a noble savage. Further, there are many demonic religions out there. Jews and the Mohammedans. Jews and Mohammedans are religions of Antichrist. And what I mean by Antichrist is what 1 John says Antichrist is. Antichrist is anyone who denies that Jesus is the Son of God. Jews and Mohammedans deny that Jesus is the Son of God. Therefore, their religion is Antichrist. It is specifically Antichrist. Now, we need to make a distinction between this and, we might say, pre-Christ. St. Justin Martyr called the Greek philosophers He said that the Greek philosophers had the logos spermatikos, the seed of the word, the seed of the logos. Plato and Aristotle were not Antichrist, they were pre-Christ. They did not have an opportunity to deny Christ because Christ had not come yet. So this is much different than Jews and Mohammedans. Jews and Mohammedans have religions which are specifically and explicitly denying Jesus Christ. Now, here's a very important question. Are Protestants Antichrist because they are not true Christians? Protestants are heretics. Now, a heretic is a Christian who denies a proposition necessary for salvation. Now, the church would distinguish then a heretic from what we might say a Mormon who denies the Nicene Creed and does not have a baptism, does not have a valid baptism. I mean, we would consider a Mormon to be a pagan, basically. He would probably be a more enlightened pagan than a Hindu, but still a pagan. Whereas a Protestant is a heretic. So they are also part of the same spirit of Antichrist, because Antichrist denies that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, but that must not only be in theory, not only in the clouds, not only in heaven, Jesus is the Son of God, but Jesus is also the Son of God on earth. I.e., the Roman Catholic Church is his body, his mystical body. When you deny the Roman Catholic Church, you deny his body. So Protestants believe in the head. They believe that Jesus is the Son of God in his head, but they deny his body. So in a way, you might say they are half Christian or half Catholic. That's what a heretic is. The word hairesis means to choose. It means to take two truths and only choose one and reject the other. That's what a heretic means. So we may say that they are Antichrist in that sense. Now, this is a subject for my book, and I'm planning to do a show more on that. It's called the Conspiracy of Antichrist, which is what I see as the spiritual nature of the momentum and cultures. But it's another show. So this is error number 3, which we spent a lot of time on because it's a very important error that's very prevalent. The point is that the world and flesh and the devil are strong. And we cannot have a sure hope that non-Catholics will be saved because they're deprived of the truth. They may be led astray by demons. They may be led astray by the world, the flesh, word of the flesh. Can we say in theory that they could be saved? Yes, we can say in theory because it's reasonable based on invincible ignorance. But we cannot have certainty and we cannot have reasonable hope. So, error number 4. Now here's where we get into the difficulties of our modern epoch. And I know you guys have had some questions and I haven't been able to follow all the chat. So we can get to some questions in about 5-10 minutes. But here's Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 41. Error number 4 is revolutionary movements. Now, here's a great quote from Russell Kirk. This is from The American Cause, page 119. He says this. Here's the error. In every age, there is much human discontent, and in nearly every age, there arises some revolutionary movement which takes advantage of that discontent. Now, the discontent comes from your conscience. A properly formed conscience has a true discontent with something that's wrong. A true conscience, remember, not an erroneous conscience, you're making a judgment about something that's just or unjust. So you have real discontent that is real, that's valid, it's true. But Kirk is saying there are elites, revolutionaries, who take advantage of that. Now, I'm going to read from Gaudium et Spes, 41. The church can anchor the dignity of human nature against all tides of opinion, for example, those that undervalue the human body or idolize it. By no human law can the personal dignity and liberty of man be so aptly safeguarded as by the gospel of Christ that has been entrusted to the church. For this gospel announces and proclaims the freedom of the sons of God and repudiates all the bondage that ultimately results from sin. So we're talking about real freedom, not fake freedom, not the freedom preached by the world, but true freedom. Only the church can form the consciences of society. Sort of implied in this paragraph is the denial of the separation of church and state. The church must inform the conscience of the culture. Now here's where we talk about the revolutionary movements. The church, therefore, by virtue of the gospel committed to her, proclaims the rights of man. Leo XIII and John Paul II both said, the rights of God and the rights of man stand or fall together. So the church proclaims the rights of man. She acknowledges, now here's the key point, she greatly esteems the dynamic movements of today, by which these rights are everywhere fostered. Yet these movements must be penetrated by the spirit of the gospel and protected against any kind of false autonomy. That's false freedom. That is what we're talking about, false freedom. For we are tempted to think that our personal rights are fully ensured only when we are exempt from every requirement of divine law. But this way lies not the maintenance of the dignity of the human person, but its annihilation. This is the false freedom. And this is a great passage from Vatican II saying that the false freedom is not the dignity of man. It is its annihilation. Now, what's interesting here is that it says the church greatly esteems the dynamic movements of today by which these rights are everywhere fostered. This document was promulgated in 1965. In the year before that, Martin Luther King had just won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he had become world famous for his nonviolent resistance to Jim Crow. Now, this is the beginning of our current woes with Black Lives Matter, because the civil rights movement, especially when you go back to the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King was using certain Christian principles. He was forgiving his enemies, for example. Forgiving your enemies. Purely Christian principle. Mohammedans don't do that. He was forgiving his enemies. He was using peaceful means as much as possible. He had become world famous. Now, but Vatican II says here, these movements must be penetrated by the spirit of the gospel and protected against any kind of false autonomy. Otherwise, it doesn't go to the dignity of man, it goes to his annihilation. And this is exactly what has happened to the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, and this is a whole nother show, which maybe we'll do in January during Martin Luther King Day. Martin Luther King was an imperfect Christian. Very imperfect, in fact. But, like I said, he forgave his enemies. This is something that Christians do. That is a Christian quality. Malcolm X, who in some ways was a bit more rational than Martin Luther King regarding violence, he's assassinated at 65. Martin Luther King assassinated at 68. The civil rights movement is cut off from at least some certain amount of rational and Christian or religious leaders. And what takes over is the Marxist leaders, the Black Panthers and whatnot. And as a result, the civil rights movement is not penetrated with the spirit of the gospel. Now, again, it's another show, but Martin Luther King, one of his, Bayard Rustin, one of his people that he worked with, was a gay rights activist. And this is what penetrated the civil rights movement, not with the spirit of the gospel, but the spirit of Antichrist, the Marxist spirit, which is the revolutionary spirit, which is where the elites take advantage of a real discontent. Obviously, the blacks were really discontented, truly against the injustice of Jim Crow. It's an injustice. They have a real discontent. It's true. But then the elites started to manipulate it, as they're doing today. Black Lives Matter. Of course, Black Lives Matter. Of course, Black Lives Matter. White Lives Matter. Every life matters. That's a real discontent. You know, if there is real racism, there is real racism in the world. I think it's terribly overblown, but when there is real racism, yes, that's a sin. That's a real discontent. Nobody should be judged by their ethnicity. But then the elites step in and they manipulate the discontent. That is the error. Number 4, this is the use of your conscience. It is the manipulation of your conscience by elites. And that is what we have. This is what we have with these revolutionary movements. And this has been going on really since Adam and Eve. Satan manipulated the discontent of Eve. And part of that was a natural law discontent, because God placed in our natural law and our inclination by grace a desire to fulfill our nature. Now, by grace, we have a desire to have union with God. And Satan uses the manipulation, uses a discontent, and manipulates it into his own ends. And this is what has happened in our own day. We are still living under the slavery of a false freedom. We think we're free. We're in bondage. We're slaves. The revolutionaries have manipulated our discontent into bondage. This is really the political, social, cultural error that has been gripping Euro-America for decades. This false revolutionary mindset, which manipulates the discontent, which is a true discontent, but gets manipulated to its own ends. So, these are the 4 errors that I see in particular, and we're going to be talking further in future shows about freedom of conscience, freedom of liberty, important topics. But this is some of the foundation of this important topic. I'm going to go back through the chat. If you guys have any questions, let me see if anybody has any questions. So Vox Populi says, if Jesus liberates us from sin, why do we commit even the same sin again? Well, it is because the liberation is a healing. It is a healing and a interior renovation, an interior liberation, which is a healing of our sin, which habituates us. A virtue is a habit. That's what a virtue is. You have to habituate through sanctifying grace, through sacramental grace, actual grace. God habituates you to do the right and hate the evil. And in so doing, he sanctifies you. Why do you commit the same sin over and over? Well, it is because you are struggling against the habituation to sin. God liberates you from sin. God is not a revolutionary. Revolutionaries want everything changed right now. That's how they manipulate you. That's not how the church operates. That's not how God operates. God does not change you from black and white in a day. Just as he grows little children into men and women, he grows the Christian into a saint gradually. The reason is because grace builds on nature. He doesn't destroy our nature, because if our Lord tells the parable of pulling out the cockle with the wheat, God does not destroy because if he liberated us all at once too quickly, it's like a destructive act. Now, some conversions are a lot faster than others. Depends on a lot of different things. There's a great piece by Nathaniel Richards that's coming out of Meaning of Catholic. If you're not subscribed, you can subscribe to the website. You get all of our articles that we write that goes into that. Everyone has a different beauty that God has made us with. And so our sanctifying grace, our holiness is different for each person. Let me see if Elijah Yassi, what's up, brother? Have you heard of the 7 Ages of the Church by Venerable Bartholomew Holzhauser? If so, what are your thoughts on it? I have not. I believe that is, I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. I'm not sure if that is similar to some of the other mystics who have said different prophetic things regarding different ages in the church, age of Antichrist. I mean, when I think about, there are many different prophecies from the saints, and prophetic utterances are by nature prophetic. They have a prophetic character to them, meaning that they're not explicitly spelled out in all the detail that we would need of a prediction of the future. So it's difficult to piece them all together. So we know that various things will happen in the eschaton. The Antichrist will rise. Some say the great monarch will convert the Jews and the Mohammedans, the age of Mary, the great chastisement, the little chastisement. So I think the one thing that we are most certain of is that there will be the Antichrist to deceive many, and then Christ will come. I think there are greater and lesser degrees of certainty based on the number of witnesses and the number of mystics. Honestly, I am not very well read in the different prophecies, and so I typically operate under, we should always be thinking about the fact that we're going to die tonight. So if you think about the fact that you're going to die tonight, you'll be thinking about the end times, because when you die, you go straight to the end times. There's no more time after you die. You go to your particular judgment, then the general judgment. You don't wait around. So I have not read, honestly, I'm not very well read in the prophecies. So sorry, I can't give you a better answer there. Let me see. Does original sin mean that we are in some part evil? Even if a little, are we evil? Well, we need to qualify what you mean by evil. Yes and no. God created the world. Now, God created the world and saw that it was good. He created man and saw that it was very good. So there is a certain amount of our nature that God has created, and it always has remained good. Now, original sin means, excuse me. Original sin means that our intellect is darkened, our will is weakened, and we're inclined to evil. That means that we've been wounded. It does not mean that we are evil. It means that we are sick. We need a healer. He who is sick is not evil. His nature is still good, but his nature is corrupted. His nature is not completed. It's not perfected. Now, the Protestant heretics believe that original sin, has completely corrupted our nature to the point that it is truly evil, total depravity. And so that God has to force us. Grace did not build on nature. In the Protestant heresies, grace did not build on nature. Grace overcomes nature or destroys nature. God forces you to go to heaven or forces you to go to hell in the Calvinist Lutheran mindset. It is, on the contrary, in the Catholic faith, your nature is still good, but you have been corrupted by evil. You are wounded. So grace heals your wounded nature and makes you whole again. Here's, let me see, any other questions? I don't see anything coming up, everybody. So if you have any final questions, throw them in the chat. Once again, I want to thank everybody for watching. Patrons, there's a live-only broadcast, or patron-only live broadcast tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. GMT. And please like and subscribe, share this video. If you've been helped by this video, helped by the apostolate, please support us. And also let me know any topics that will be helpful for us to cover. Always try to listen and respond to any requests for any type of content we can. So with that, let's offer up a prayer for the healing of all of our consciences, for the salvation of our own souls, so that we can offer up to God a sacrifice of praise and save our souls, and also that we may preach the gospel for the sake of those who do not know Jesus Christ and have no sure hope of salvation. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster qui es in caeli, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.